Commander Farsight has become a hero of the Tau Empire for his actions against the Orcs on Arkanasha and his incredible insight penned in the Book of the Beast. In this second part of his epic tale, he faces a new foe, and a war that will see him become legendary in the eyes of his kin. My name is Michael, the Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. The Tau's first encounters with the Imperium of Man were based on infiltration, although the masses of humanity eventually learned of their subversion and a storm of violence followed. The resultant war crossed the Damocles Gulf, breaking upon the heartlands of the Tau Empire. Without Farsight, the Sept Worlds themselves might well have been wiped out. Ethereal Aunva, master of the undying spirit, and in my opinion a bit of a tool, was undoubtedly an inspiration to all who heard him speak. Second only to Aunwë of the Whispering Wisdom himself, his steely passion for the accelerated progress of the Tau Empire had seen them claim world after world during the Second Sphere expansion, which had primarily been led by Commander Puretide. Whether in times of war or peace, Aunva's acumen for politics bordered on supernatural. It was said by many that any feat achievable by the Firecast through force could be achieved through words alone by Aunva. This claim was initially born when the Tau ventured to the other side of the yawning stellar anomaly known as the Damocles Gulf. Situated coreward of the Tau Empire, i.e. towards the centre of the galaxy, the Gulf was a region which had long spelled little more than confusion and death for the Tau. Unknown forces roiled within it like oceanic currents that could not be predicted or monitored by conventional science. Warp magic, I would suspect. However, the invention of the ZFR Horizon Accelerator engine by the Earthcast revolutionized the way the Tau crossed the Sea of Stars. It allowed them to travel at near light speed, circumventing the worst of the Gulf's malevolent attentions. Within years of the ZFR engine's invention, the Tau had successfully crossed the Gulf and begun to explore the cluster of worlds on the other side. Instead of conquering them through war, Aunva masterminded a long and subtle campaign of integration. It took decades, but the Tau inveigled themselves into the human civilizations dwelling there, through trade, diplomacy, and above all, patience. They effectively converted the human worlds into extensions of the Tau Empire without a single shot being fired. However, this drew, eventually, the attention of the Imperium. It is an interstellar behemoth, cumbersome indeed, but mighty and vengeful beyond reason. Word eventually filtered back to the High Lords of Terror that the worlds they had controlled in the Timbra subsector on the eastern fringe no longer paid tithes, and worse still, their planetary governors were in thrall to a Xenos race. This would not go unpunished, and so the Imperium responded with slow but unstoppable force. The promising Damocles expansion ended in a series of harrowing wars that saw the Tau driven back from their newly acquired planets to the Sept Worlds of the First Sphere, the original core worlds of the Empire. Even worse, the Imperial fleets had not been content to let the Tau flee. The cathedral ships of the military crossed the Gulf using arcane science that defied description, opening portals in the fabric of space, and soon the warriors they carried fell upon the heartlands of the alien civilization that dared encroach on their sovereign empire. The first planetary target was Dalith Sept, a prosperous, highly cultured system with its origins in the First Sphere expansion. The defences of the outlying colony worlds of Hydas, Silkel, and Vissel collapsed. The Imperium's ram-beat starships blasted their way across space, the battleships of the Space Marines at their fore. Humanity's armada was like nothing the Tau had encountered before, colossal in scale and with barely a nod to grace, a graveyard of marble-encrusted tombs torn from some forbidden undersea church spewed out into the Tau homelands. The sudden appearance of the Imperials caught the Tau completely off guard, even though the Tau Navy scrambled what ships it could from Dalith, Praen, and Dalair. The throng of colossi in their midst outweighed them massively. The Imperium's warships were like armoured whales next to the brightly coloured shoals of aircast fighters that ripped and tore at them with little effect. A strange battle commenced as each admiral took the measure of their foe and were left confounded. Amidst the sheer power of the largest Imperial battleships, even Mantas, Custodians, and Startide-class interceptors were outclassed. In turn, the unparalleled mobility of the Tau craft allowed them to evade every Imperial gun and boarding torpedo pointed at them. Until the Tau Armada could scramble battlecruiser fleets from the Corvatra Navy docks on the system's edge, Dallas Sept was on its own. A period of unprecedented mayhem and confusion erupted as the Imperial fleet fought its way through the orbital defenses of Praetor and barged onto Dallas Sept, intending to make planetfall no matter the cost. Commander Farsight was briefed and told that his forces would join those of his old training rifle, Osha Sarah, Commander Shadowsun as she would become to be known, in repelling the Imperium from Daleth. Oshova swore he would either cleanse the planet or die. There would be no retreat like there was on Arkanasha, only victory or death. The aircast of Daleth knew their efforts would be pivotal in the war that was coming. They meditated as the Imperial fleet approached, but each had a spark of anticipation in his heart. That spark was fanned into a flame by Farsight's historic speech at Zephyr Peak, an address playing to the aircast's pride, patriotism, and skill in equal measure. Under the direction of Farsight's trusted aircast ally, Admiral Kor-O Limau Teng, the pilots of the Sept worlds would counterattack in force. The Imperium descended with such murderous violence that the skies turned black with carbon within a week. Grotesquely large dropships painted in the drab olive tones of the Imperial Guard were the first to fall. They approached in a two-stage vector that saw them first act as attack carriers, then as mechanized transports deploying troops and tanks on a massive scale. The skies above Dallas hexadomes were soon buzzing and roaring with the engines of crude Imperial vehicles. War scarred the skies long before a shot was fired on the purple-grassed plains below. With the Imperials committed, squadron after squadron of Barracudas, Razor Sharks, Tiger Sharks, and Sunshark bombers lifted out of the hexadomes across the planet, linking their sensor suites in a lattice of supporting data. They met in midair to form staggered picket lines, supported by clouds of drones that buzzed in their wake like obedient insects. Any enemy aircraft caught in their net would be shot down in short order. Above the cityscape of the largest of domes, Imperial thunderbolts zigzagged to escape the matrix the Tau were drawing. Almost every Imperial craft that ran the gauntlet was caught by interceptor fire and sent down in flames. Ponderous marauder bombers were overtaken by the bow wave of the sky lattice, their rudimentary wings burnt from their bodies and blunt fuselages carved into chunks, spiraling onto the plains below. Valkyries, Vendettas, and dozens of other types of craft besides were hunted by darting razor shark fighters, the fat frames of the flyers punctured by salvos of pinpoint ion fire. Prowling below, Farsight's earthbound interceptor cadres sent Skyray missiles winging up to take out those few aircraft that still trespassed above. Before the aircast could ensure total aerial supremacy, the eagle-proud strike craft in low orbit began to mete out their revenge. Punishing barrages hammering the Tau ground forces and strike cruisers launching their deadly cargo toward Gelbrin, the largest hexadome. Armored pods hammered out of the skies in groups, their downward passage piercing the explosions and drawing columns of flame to their impact point. Farsight had to admit, he was impressed. The direct bravery of such a deployment vector was commendable, and he decided to take his own force of crisis teams to the site of this attack. The aircast's trawling tactic had been extremely effective against the crude craft of the Guard, but they were found wanting when the strike cruisers above sent their own squadrons into the fight. Huge warrior craft, emblazoned in bright heraldic colours, triggered their afterburners to hurtle almost vertically, stubbed-winged escort crafts on either side. Monitor drone scans picked out the icons emblazoned on the flanks. These were Space Marine craft, their blunt hulls somehow reminiscent of flying fists, launched with much the same intent. The gunship squadrons roared towards the aircast trawlernet with terrific speed, guns blasting away. Incredibly, the heavily armoured steersmen of each craft seemed to be seeking mid-air collisions, roaring at a tight downward angle into the ordered matrix of Tau craft. the aircast pilots were forced to break formation, wheeling away in evasive maneuvers. How could their foes be so reckless and suicidal? Was their faith in whatever deity they worshipped so strong they believed themselves immortal? Well, they are Space Marines, so I guess so. With his battlesuit teams leaping out from graceful Manta destroyers and his ground forces transported en masse by the planet's magnorail networks, Oshova was able to react to the incursions of the Marines with impressive speed. Targeting data acquired on the far side of the Gulf had shown the Imperial shock troops to be extremely heavy armor, and so Farsight took the precaution of having every crisis suit equipped with dual plasma rifles. This was the right decision. The mass shells fired by the Space Marine squads deploying were fierce indeed, but few penetrated the armoured shells of the battlesuits arcing from the skies. Under Farsight's instruction, whenever one battlesuit was hit, it would peel back to be replaced by a fully operational replacement. Wave by wave, the crisis teams descended, their numbers such that from a distance they looked like a Violan seed storm floating to Earth. Hundreds of plasma rifles spat bursts of burning fire into the ranks of the Marines, melting ceramite and searing flesh to scorch the ground beneath. The Imperial warriors were not so much shot as cored, the holes in their torsos exposing innards to the air. Eesh. Incredibly, many of the fallen Marines fought on, firing powerful sidearms from the ground and shouting their defiance even as they died. It was an amazing display of fortitude and determination in the face of devastating firepower, which impressed Farsight deeply, as did the courage of the white-armoured medics known as apothecaries who administered to their fallen brothers. Yet courage would not be enough. By that time, the Fire Warrior support cadres had arrived, and all that remained of the Space Marine insertion within Galbrin was smoking ruin. As all-out war unfolded in the sky, the monstrous tracked transports of the Guard and the giant walkers stomping in their vanguard simply ignored the aircast's best efforts. Their shields and thick hides were all but impenetrable to anything short of a railgun, and they knew it. The vast metal transport settled in great wallowing clouds of steam before unfurling their ramps, disgorging regiment after regiment of soldiers. Strike forces of Tau moved to intercept, but wherever they came into view, the immense walkers that flanked each deployment ramp would unleash such intense firepower that the hunter cadres were forced to take evasive action. The massive machines were demigods. Each was an avatar of destruction given form on an undreamt scale, even by the most ambitious of the Earthcast. Here was mankind's warlike deity made manifest, just as the effigy walkers of the Orcs represented their own belligerent gods. I have to wonder what class of Titan they were using here. As they were escort vehicles, my theory is Warhound. Under the protection of these god machines, endless ranks of Imperial soldiery marched, appearing as insects next to their looming custodians. Elsewhere, thousands of ponderous tanks churned the planet's indigo grass into thick mud as they rumbled into formation. Farsight's hunter cadres were ready to engage, but even the most veteran Fireblade was forced to admit that the sheer scale of the task was bewildering. In the space of a day, the Imperium had bulldozed a series of beachheads onto Daleth, with little more than faith and force. Despite sustaining heavy losses, they were slowly converging on the capital hexadomes central to the eastern Hab states. As night fell, Commander Farsight called an emergency conclave of those commanders not yet directly involved. The Space Marines that had dared to assault Galbrin had been neutralized, but the vast bulk of the Imperials were yet to engage. Their advance was stalled by staggered missile strikes from the hills around Galbrin, and their outriders had been slain by stealth teams, but the core remained. The battle had just begun. As Farsight was bringing his conclave to a consensus of all-out attack, an athletic female swept into the room. Her self-possession and cold beauty demanded attention as she strode to the command bridge, head held high. She moved in front of Farsight, blocking him from view as she outlined her plan. The Firecast Reserve would join her hunter cadres in a series of stealth attacks, using the darkness and drawing the enemy to overextend themselves. Only then would the true counterattacks be launched. She issued specific orders to those commanders not belonging to Farsight's contingent, and one by one, they bowed. When Commander Shadowsun strode out, without a single word to her former training partner Farsight, a full half of the emergency conclave went with her. Farsight's grip on his sword tightened, but he held his peace. Note, this is not the Dawn Blade. He recalled the words of Master Puretide, reminding himself that though he and his fellow commander were very different, they strove for the same goal. That evening he contented himself with observing and analysing the data so far harnessed concerning the Imperial invasion. There was much to be learned. Scant hours later, there came reports of a series of devastating attacks that had been made under cover of darkness. The tactics employed were no doubt Oshasera's. Commander Farsight would recognise them anywhere. The Imperium's immense phalanxes were flailing blindly, lashing out in all directions as their outlying vehicles were destroyed, one after another, by point-blank fusion fire. As soon as their primitive vision sensors had been opened wide to scry the Dalithan night, Oshasera had released bursts of multispectral light, blinding her prey even more effectively than the pitch darkness of the plains. Confusion reigned around the perimeter as each column was hemmed in by the great mass of the vehicle company. Spearheads of battle tanks and super heavy ordnance split from the main mass where they could, blasting a path through the Magna Rail tunnels that blocked in order to pursue the signal ghost of this threat. Farsight smiled. Knowing Oshasera, they'd be lucky if they tagged a single battlesuit. The war that unfolded over the next few months saw the differing styles of Puretide students writ large. Their strategies were painted upon the canvas of Dallas battlefields in blood. Wherever Oshasera's infiltration and misdirection blinded the military behemoth of the Imperial Guard, Space Marines raced to intercept, their rugged technology and engineered strength overmatching the stealth teams and forcing them away. As soon as the Space Marines committed themselves, however, Oshova and his battlesuit spearheads would fall from above, crippling them with broadside fire and meeting the stranded survivors in a series of deadly close-quarter battles. How they won them, I don't really know, because the only Tau who can fight is Farsight, but Space Marines. In the sky above, Koro Limau Teng's aircast pilots took a heavy toll. Even the Admiral himself joined the fight in his personalized Barracuda, hunting Space Marine gunships like a golden raptor harrying a pack of corvettes. A young progeny of the original Commander Brightsword excelled himself in a series of close-quarter battlesuit actions. I can only assume the original Commander Brightsword is either dead or retired. At the Battle of Varisar Gate, even managing to stamp a skull-masked warrior leader into a broken mass of ceramite and pulped flesh in one assault. Farsight commissioned his ingenious Earthcast ally Ovesa from Arkanasha to devise new weapons capable of dealing with the armoured tanks of the Imperium, and the scientist teams worked day and night distributing them as and when via the messenger warriors at the Aircast. However, the Marines struck back hard, eventually assailing Gelbrin City with an insertion pod assault so ferocious that it shattered the roof of the Hexadome and blew out the atmosphere inside. Even Farsight had to retreat when the Imperials teleported their own war-suited warriors, Terminators, into the central plaza. Tau blood ran in the streets as armoured companies ringed the city, cutting off any escape from the Space Marines inside. It was a story repeated 5 more times in 5 more cities before the war was over, for a company of Space Marines was committed to each conquest, each one a force that even the finest of the Firecast cadres were hard-pressed to match. The bitter war was categorized not by martial prowess alone, but by a hectic race for information. This was the first time the two races had fought one another. The empires fought not only to defeat their foes, but to understand them. The Imperium changed tack after the Battle of Via Meshla, where outgunned guard regiments successfully charged a Tau gun line and won a bloody victory purely with bayonets and boots. Since then, they drove to engage the Tau at close quarters whenever they could. For his part, Oshova studied them relentlessly. He endlessly adapted strategies, counter-strategies, and target priorities, distributing drone-borne guider programs to all commanders. The Imperium took the Codex Astartes and applied its principles to whatever was thrown at them. The Hammers of Dawn of the Imperial Fist were especially efficient at codifying Tau threats and responding in force, for they lived every word of the Codex and never deviated from it no matter the cost. Farsight took a great interest in these patterns emerging through the Imperial war effort, making extensive notes and even refining simulations as the war unfolded. The Imperial armies valued armour above all else. Their vehicles were so heavy that even hammerheads struggled to reap the casualties expected. In direct response, Farsight pioneered the deadly Sun-Forged pattern of battlesuit. This allowed crisis teams to drop from Manta destroyers onto their prey, cripple them with fusion blasters, and then boost away to be picked up by the Mantas on the return run. Meanwhile, Oshacera took her stealth cadres to the dark side of Dalith, constantly moving in rotation with the sun so that every raid she performed was under cover of darkness. Farsight did not monitor her through open comms, but by the trail of smoking wrecks she left behind her. When the warrior master of the Scar Lord's chapter carved a red path through the magna rails of the government district of Dalith, Farsight gave permission to the lone Monat pilot Sharko Vash to intercept. The Monat blasted his way to the heart of the Scar Lord's force, only to be brought to his knees by the war-suited bodyguards of the Imperial Lord. Sharko Vash boosted forward with one last charge, triggering an experimental stasis failsafe at the exact moment the Lord raised his blade to strike, freezing the warriors in place at the crux of the conflict. Hundreds of years later, the two mighty warriors are still trapped in the resultant sphere of timelessness, raised up outside the rebuilt core assembly house of Dalith as a centerpiece monument to the greater good. Despite their best efforts, the forces commanded by Farsight and Oshacera could not be everywhere at once. The Imperium was powerful indeed, and unlike the Orcs, it appeared to have a strategy worked out for every environment and tactic the Tau could engineer. In defiance of the Firecast's spirited defense, the Imperium had irresistibly overtaken several of the planet's cities, slaughtering any Tau within and fortifying the structures. The Ethereals in command of the war effort could not countenance such losses. Ever more extreme measures were taken to stall the Imperial advance whilst reinforcements were brought in from other worlds and beyond. Yet on the field of battle, far more drastic measures were being taken. To Farsight's quiet horror, experimental neurochip prototypes containing the recorded strategies of Puretide were surgically installed into the minds of cadre fireblades and battlesuit commanders, allowing them to function as military leaders that thought alike and could adapt to any situation. That was the theory, at least, though the swords of Puretide enjoyed great success against the rank and file. When the forces of the Imperium brought forth strange gaunt shamans who reduced battlesuits to naught but ruin with gestures of their wizened hands, the implanted leaders had none of their own previous learnings to draw upon and faltered badly. Puretide had never fought a Psyker. The confusion cost hundreds of lives as the minds of the leaders struggled to respond to this threat. As the war effort looked about to unravel, Kroot mercenaries were dispatched by the thousands through the Magna Rail network, rushed to wherever the Imperium forced a breach in the network of tunnels crisscrossing Dalith, spilling out like blood from an opened artery to fall upon the Imperial troops. Zipping through the sky above would come hundreds of gun drones, their pulse rifle fire taking a butcher's toll as they hovered out of reach. In this way, the Imperial forces were pinned long enough for Farsight or Oshacera to scramble their cadres to the breach and avenge the Kroots that had given their lives. Farsight took this one step further at the siege of Ralatas, a dome city famous for its sculptures of living light. With the Tau's most capable commanders engaged on the other side of the planet, an Imperial dropship landed only a few miles from the gates. Within hours, Ralatas was surrounded by Imperial tanks, including several super heavies powerful enough to blast breaches in the walls. With the exception of the Kroot that made their homes in the arboreal districts, the city had only a small garrison of fire warriors, certainly nothing that could deal with over 1,000 tanks. Shah, a cadre fireblade in charge of the garrison, packed through an urgent message to Farsight. Osho could give him no help, but said he would think. Less than a minute later, a reply came to Shah, and he spread the word to the Earthcast. Just as the Imperials breached the walls and began to barge their way in, the city went dark. Suddenly, a massive electromagnetic pulse boomed outward as every one of the city's light sculptures, fusion arrays, and code generators hurled their potential energy in a devastating wave. The EMP tidal wave scrambled the cogitators of every tank and walker within a mile of the walls, stopping them dead. It was then that massed Kroot squads poured out of every breach, bounding and leaping to the foe, Kroot hounds running down those who tried to flee, while Krootoxen ripped through the open hatches and doors of the silenced tanks, allowing their kin to climb inside. The grisly feast that followed has never been broadcast openly on town propaganda channels, though it is said Oshova has watched it many times. Though the Imperium took a great toll, and half of Dalith had been abandoned or reduced to rubble, the attacks were losing momentum. The Tau used everything they learned thus far to great effect, using the EMPs that saved Ralatas to divide into disparate chunks the Imperial armies and take them apart piece by piece. In the process, they bought enough time for the other sept worlds, such as Viola and Tau, to contribute reinforcements. A steady stream of Firecast cartridges made planetfall every day, and the Imperial Navy was forced to retreat in the face of overwhelming numbers. As for the Space Marines, their dogmatic adherence to certain strategies and tactics eventually undid them. In conjunction with Oshasera, Oshova masterminded several large-scale assaults that saw his fellow commander drive the Space Marines into the open, only for Oshova to fall upon them with all the speed and fury that he was now famous for. As the weeks ground on, the masters of the crusade for the Imperium were forced to admit that they were spread too thin. The Tau supply lines were now established, so they had an almost limitless supply of material for the war, and astropathic messages transmitted across the Gulf spoke of a new threat assailing the Imperium, the hive fleets of the Tyranids. Regiment by regiment, company by company, the Imperial presence upon Dalith withdrew. Farsight and his acolytes were already preparing to encircle and destroy the retreating Imperials when a contingent of diplomats from the Watercast came. As a trio of ethereals walked through the door of the High Command behind them, Oshova felt something strange in his mind, a sense of future paths forking, of destiny. As the Watercast observed the etiquette that was appropriate for it, the ethereals delivered their message. The Imperial troops were being allowed to flee unhindered. A communique had been received from Captain Savaliak of the Hammers of Dawn, accepting the truce offered by the Watercast. By his manner of speech, the ethereal said it was obvious that such a gesture was extremely rare for humanity's warriors. The captain taking pains to stress that without the honourable conduct the Tau had exhibited in the early stages of war, and the pressing concerns of invasion from the north, this eventuality would have never come to pass. The Watercast decided not to challenge the humans' proclamations, for they knew the Imperium had spended the merest fraction of its might against them. Nevertheless, though the Tau's confidence in their own supremacy was severely shaken, they had triumphed in the final reckoning and learned much of the Imperium. Not only did the Imperium withdraw from Dalith Sept, but from Tau space altogether, retreating across the Damocles Gulf in as strange a way as they had come, using the warp. They left behind a swathe of broken and abandoned tech, every last piece of which was recovered by the Earthcast and studied in painstaking detail. The vast majority was declared inferior, of no use to the greater good, though Ovesa made some astonishing discoveries in his labs about the esoteric technologies used by the human fleets. As for the commanders dubbed the Swords of Puretide, those implanted with the engram chips, all that had been surgically inserted into the warrior leaders were forcibly removed. This left those who had been operated upon as drooling and pliant simpletons, similar to servitors. Yet, as the Watercast patiently explained, such was sometimes the painful cost of victory. When Alvar and his honor guard came to collect Farsight's old teammate, Commander Shavastos, for his scheduled engram removal, the veteran warrior was absent. When questioned, Oshova mournfully informed them that Shavastos had in fact fallen, and his body had been burnt in an unrecognizable crisp in the last engagement. Such was the cost of victory, said Oshova, dipping his head in sorrow. Alvar met Farsight's gaze for a long time before turning on his heel and heading back the way he had come, his ceremonial escort, his honor guard, trailing in his wake. A few years after the Damocles Crusade, the triumph of Dalith became tinged with tragedy. Commander Puretide was rapidly declining in health, and such was his wisdom that no engram nor student could encompass his teachings entirely. Ethereal Master Alvar decreed that for the greater good to become manifest, Commander Puretide must live on in as many fashions as possible. Whilst in public he joined in the mourning of Puretide's death, he had the commander's corpse subjected to extensive brain scans behind closed doors, his dissected mind rebuilt into a complex AI that was installed in a hollow throne at the peak of Mount Kanji. Just in case his plan to hold on to Puretide's wisdom via technological means was not sufficient, Alvar issued an edict for his most prominent pupils to be placed into semi-permanent stasis. These masters of war were only to be awoken when the Tam Empire had need of them most. Oshasera and O'Case were amongst those frozen in this manner. The Ethereal Council had other plans for Oshova, plans that were to raise him to the height of glory and ultimately, in doing so, dash him into disgrace. The Tau Empire had faced off against an insanely strong opponent and emerged victorious. The Imperial war machine had withdrawn from Tau space to face a new galactic threat, the Tyranids of High Fleet Behemoth, leaving the worlds of the Damocles Gulf lightly garrisoned. Every one of the worlds settled on the other side of the Damocles Gulf had been left to the Imperium in the early stages, and one of the prime set worlds had been badly mauled, which had left the Tau's natural supremacy in the universe shaken to its core. Ethereal Master Aunvar believed this time of doubt, known now as the time of questioning, could have profound consequences. He reported to the High Council that the Firecast had experienced their first ever large-scale defeats, and the prospect of the Imperium having committed only a fraction of its might was daunting in the extreme. Not only that, he had reason to believe the Tau people's faith in their destiny was showing cracks. This could not stand. Without ambition of faith, the Tau Va, the grand plan for the Tau race, would falter and die. Actually, I get that wrong. The Tau Va it kind of is the greater good, basically. Aunvar believed that preventing this could mean not only reclaiming the lost worlds on the other side of the Gulf, but also establishing more bases and orbital stations than ever before. Only then would the Tau be reassured that the war with the Imperium was only a setback and not the first sign of doom. Aunvar implored Imperial Supreme Aunwei, whose days were drawing to a close by this point, for the right to launch a reconquest of the Damocles Gulf, and he saw the wisdom in Aunvar's words. After much deliberation, Aunwei acquiesced not only to the plan for reconquest, but also to the proposal that Oshova should lead it. The Tau would head back out to the stars, their optimism and self-belief rekindled by the finest military mind of their time. The might and support of every caste, including the Ethereals, would be behind him. News of Farsight's ability and aptitude for war had spread throughout the Empire. Since the reconquest of Arkanasha and the successful repulsion of the Imperium, Oshova was saluted by all ranks of the Firecast whenever he passed, and his counsel was taken by every caste save the Ethereals. Aunvar's decision for Farsight to lead was not taken lightly, but when the matter was settled, it had the full power behind it. The first few weeks saw Oshova elevated from the status of hero to that of saviour. With the persuasive arts of the water caste, Aunvar began a propaganda campaign that saw Oshova military success become oft-told legends. Statues to his greatness were erected in every battle dome, complex, and naval harbour across the worlds of the First Sphere. Fire warriors of every rank had images or holocuts of Farsight somewhere, sometimes even displayed alongside those of Aunwei and Aunvar themselves. For Oshova, the attention was bewildering and unwelcome. The commander was greeted with the hunter salute so many times he feared he would wear out his arm joints before the crusade even started. Yet he bore it all stoically, understanding that the Empire needed its heroes. In the councils of the Ethereals, there were concerns that Oshova would not live up to the propaganda. The Damocles Gulf would not fall twice to the wiles of diplomats. This time, the Firecast would have to lead the charge. If Dalith was any indication, blood would be spilt in great measure, and these worlds had no little access to reinforcements. Aunvar knowingly smiled, brushing their concerns aside. See why I think he's a tool now? The final result of all the effort saw the mobilization of the greatest fleet the Tau Empire had yet seen. The sheer number of battleships, navy vessels, escort ships, colony ships, war spheres, grav-pulse tugs, dropships, and outrider patrols assembled for the coalition defied belief. Once the preparations were complete, Aunwei gave one of his final speeches, and the fleet of the Great Reclamation was launched to the Damocles Gulf amongst grand celebration. Something in Farsight's gut felt strange, but he was the model of a noble commander nonetheless. If the Empire needed a conqueror he would be. During the hours of the journey across the Gulf when he was not in stasis, Farsight gathered every action report and drone capture snippet that he could from the war for Dalith. With the help of Commander Brightsword and his old ally Ovesa, Oshova built up a comprehensive picture of Imperial war doctrine. Day and night, he pored over how the armies of humanity acted and reacted in different situations and war theatres, how they made planetfall, what provoked them, and what it took to break them. There were elements of their armies, notably the Hammers of Dawn, whose adherence to a set methodology was nigh on fanatical. Such was the diligence and precision with which they observed their doctrines, that in studying them, Farsight was able to write down their imperatives as a set of commandments. By the time his coalition crossed the Gulf, Oshova had pieced together much of what he and his lieutenants referred to as the human war schematic, a code that he believed the Imperium's troops observed at all times. In doing so, he learned a good deal about the blind spots in the Tau's traditional military doctrine as well, and began to adjust his repertoire of strategies to compensate for these oversights. As the Tau arrived once more on the far side of the Gulf, Farsight used his newfound knowledge to dramatic effect. With the bulk of their military in the sector pulled away to engage High Fleet Behemoth, Oshova found himself waging a series of campaigns in which he held the advantage from the outset. The planetary defense forces left to garrison the world of the Timbra sector, that over 100 million strong on planets such as Vespertine and Matinsong, were lured into mock wars by Vanguard Tau forces. Time after time, modest raids would lure out defenders hoping to secure a front only they considered relevant. Once they committed themselves, the remainder of Farsight's force would fall and deliver a killing blow of such efficacy it would have impressed even Puretide. Over and over again, Oshova's foresight paid off, and the Tau Empire rejoiced with every conquest. Through a combination of military acumen, hard work, and drive, Commander Farsight had lived up to the inflated claims the Ethereals had made in his name. World by world, combat by combat, the Damocles Gulf was brought back to the fold. The reconquest of the four principal worlds on the distant side of the Gulf were bloody in the extreme. Farsight's ability to second-guess his foes made for a string of impressive victories, but as the anarchy of battle rolled out across the sector, the Imperium dealt the expedition a great many wounds of its own. By the time the fleet had reached the last system of the previously colonized region, there were fewer than half the original ships remaining. Oshova felt every loss keenly, not merely as a military setback, but as an emotional, spiritual wound. His ethereal advisors made it clear there would be no more reinforcements, not this far from the Empire. The Tau were not the only ones to take advantage of the Imperium's armies, however. By the time the coalition arrived, the asteroid belt to the east of the Enclaves was infested with orcs. The Tau fleet mounted a series of swift raids to repel the orc raiders from their recaptured territory, each successful and efficient. However, as space-capable drones made their scans, the horrible truth became clear. Almost every asteroid large enough to contain them was teeming with orcs, and if the fleet's readings were correct, the asteroid belt was but the tip of an empire stretching into the next star system. Farsight's expedition was on the brink of total victory, but the orc presence disturbed him greatly. He meditated for many hours upon the new information, and upon returning to his command bridge, he gave an order that would shake the Tau Empire to its core. He announced that the destruction of the orcs was a higher priority than concluding the Reconquest. He would expend every effort to exterminate them, targeting every planet they had infected in this system and the next. It was the first time a Tau of any rank had disobeyed a direct order from the Imperial Council. Oshova's decision was an unthinkable breach of the chain of command. For the newly claimed Farsight Enclaves, as they would come to be known, it was only the beginning. And with that, we arrive at the conclusion of the second part of Farsight's saga. With the victory on Dalith and the reconquest of the Damocles Gulf, he is now the legendary hero of the Tau Empire. But he has taken his first step down the renegade's path, disobeying the Ethereals to hunt down the orcs that menace his newly conquered worlds. What awaits him, and how does he come to possess the Dawnblade? All this and more to come. This is a real joy to tell Farsight's story. I'm really loving it. However, I still don't know if I'm going to be able to get this in 3 parts. The third part we'll be doing is the fight against the orcs. We will be doing Arthas Malok, probably. And there's actually a little reference coming up that I think will be really fun. I have to say, though, I am really falling in love with Farsight, to the point where I'm probably going to buy one. I'm probably going to buy Commander Farsight just to paint. Heck, maybe I'll start a Tau army. I know, heresy. Anyway, thank you very much for watching the video. I do hope you have enjoyed it. It's been an absolute pleasure. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and until the next time, may the greater good be with you. I never thought I'd say that. See you all again. Bye for now.